The mansion stood like a silent fortress on the cliffs of Malibu, glass walls gleaming under the early dawn. To the world, Alexander Voss was a man who had everything, a billionaire known for his ruthless business mind and cold perfection. To his wife, Isabella, he was a man who measured affection in dollars and love in receipts. They had been married for 3 years, but Isabella had long stopped counting anniversaries. What was there to celebrate? Her husband, one of the richest men in the country, refused to spend even a dime on her unless it served his image. Designer dresses? Only if she was attending a gala by his side. A vacation? Only if it impressed investors. Even her birthday gift, a watch, had been given with a price tag still attached, so he could return it if he chose. Luxury isn't a right, he'd said coldly once. It's earned. She had smiled then, the kind of smile that hides more than it shows. Because beneath her quiet elegance and patience, Isabella was learning. She was watching him, understanding him, not the way a wife loves a husband, but the way a strategist studies her opponent. Their marriage had started like a fairy tale. He had fallen for her at a charity gala, charmed by her intelligence and grace. But love had soon become control. He had made her sign a prenup that left her with nothing. He monitored her spending, her calls, her clothes. He believed she needed him, believed she was trapped. But Alexander didn't know the quiet power of a woman underestimated. One night, after another dinner where he reminded her how lucky she was, Isabella excused herself and walked to the balcony. Below her, waves smashed against the rocks, wild and unrestrained, everything she wished she could be. She clutched her phone tightly, reading the message again. Everything's ready. Just say the word. The sender? His trusted financial advisor, Thomas Kane, a man Alexander never realized had been growing increasingly disillusioned by his cruelty and greed. A man who had once been loyal to him, until Isabella started asking the right questions. The next morning, Alexander woke to find Isabella gone. Her wardrobe, her jewelry, everything remained as if she had simply vanished. On the kitchen counter was a small note in her handwriting. Thank you for teaching me the value of money. It's a lesson I'll never forget. He smirked. She'll come back, he said to himself. They always do. But she didn't. Days turned into weeks. And then came the shock. His accounts frozen, assets under review, and his company under investigation. Millions had been transferred to shell companies he couldn't trace. Reporters were calling. Investors were panicking. At first, he blamed hackers. Then he blamed Thomas. But when he stormed into Thomas's office, the man only gave him a tired smile. She made you pay, Alex, Thomas said quietly. For every word, every humiliation, every time you called her worthless. You should have realized she wasn't after your money. She was after her freedom. Where is she? Alexander demanded, fury trembling in his voice. Thomas only handed him an envelope. Inside was a photograph. Isabella in Italy, sunlight on her face, wearing the same smile he had stolen from her years ago. On her wrist, that same watch he had once gifted her, but now engraved with new words. My time. My terms. For the first time in his life, Alexander Voss understood the meaning of loss. Not the loss of money, but of control. He flew across continents trying to find her. Each failed attempt feeding the fire of his obsession. He began to see her everywhere, in strangers, in dreams, in the quiet moments of regret he never thought himself capable of. Meanwhile, Isabella was not living in hiding. She was building something. A name for herself, a foundation for women trapped in toxic marriages, funded by the very fortune he'd hoarded. The media adored her. She became a symbol of quiet rebellion, graced with vengeance beneath. But fate wasn't done weaving their story. Because one evening at a high-profile charity event in Paris, the same type of gala where their story had begun, Alexander walked in leaner, quieter, and utterly changed. And there she was, radiant under the golden lights, surrounded by admirers who spoke her name with respect. Their eyes met across the room. For a moment, the world shrank to the echo of old memories and unfinished words. He approached her slowly, the man who once owned everything, now stripped of the illusion of power. Isabella, he said, voice low, almost human this time. You've won. She smiled faintly, her gaze unwavering. No, Alexander, she whispered. I simply stopped losing. And as cameras flashed around them, she turned away, leaving him standing there, surrounded by all the wealth he once worshipped, but poorer than he had ever been. But that night wasn't the end, because what Alexander did next would prove that some men, no matter how broken, cannot bear to let go. He stood there long after she walked away, the laughter of strangers echoing around him, the soft hum of champagne glasses clinking in the distance. For a moment, Alexander couldn't breathe. He had faced boardrooms full of enemies, journalists tearing into him, and investors threatening to destroy everything he'd built. But nothing had ever felt like this. She had looked right through him, as if he were just another memory. And that smile, it wasn't cruel, it wasn't mocking, it was final. That was what terrified him most. He left the gala quietly, unnoticed, slipping into the Parisian night. Outside, the city was alive, indifferent to his turmoil. Every car that passed, every laugh that echoed off the cobblestones, reminded him of the life that had moved on without him. He walked for hours, hands deep in his coat pockets, her last words replaying again and again. I simply stopped losing. Back in his hotel suite, he poured himself a glass of whiskey he didn't drink. The city glittered below him, mocking his emptiness. On the table lay newspapers, headlines with her name, her face, her success. Isabella Voss Foundation empowers women globally. The woman who turned pain into power. Every story painted her as the heroine. Every word stripped him of the title he once wore so proudly. He had lost control. And Alexander Voss was a man who didn't know how to live without control. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. I want every detail about her, he said, voice low. Where she lives, who she's with, where she goes. Everything. Sir, the assistant hesitated. Is that wise? Just do it. It took less than a week. Money still opened doors. Information came quietly, piece by piece. She was living in Florence, in a villa overlooking the Arno River. She had business meetings in Milan, interviews in London, charity galas across Europe. She traveled with bodyguards now. A new world surrounded her, artists, philanthropists, politicians, and someone else. The reports mentioned a man, Julian Moreau, an art curator, charming, wealthy, kind. Pictures surfaced of him beside her, hand resting protectively on her back, his eyes filled with admiration. Alexander stared at the photo for hours, jaw tight, chest burning. He told himself it wasn't jealousy. It was unfinished business. She had taken his fortune, his reputation. She couldn't take his peace too. He needed to see her again, to understand, to make her see him again. So he flew to Florence. The villa was perched on a hill surrounded by olive trees, the sun dipping low as he arrived. He parked the car and sat there, watching the lights flicker on inside. For a moment, he almost turned away. But then the door opened, and there she was, her hair softer, her expression lighter. She looked like a woman reborn. And she wasn't alone. Julian stepped out beside her, laughing about something, holding a glass of wine. He reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. Something in Alexander snapped. He waited until Julian left in his car, then stepped out of shadows. Isabella froze when she saw him, the color draining from her face before settling into calm composure. Alexander, she said finally, her tone unreadable. You shouldn't be here. He took a step forward. We need to talk. There's nothing left to say. I disagree. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the tension he was holding back. You disappeared. You ruined me. You turned me into a ghost. Isabella, don't I at least deserve to know why? She looked at him for a long moment before sighing softly. You really don't see it, do you? He frowned. You think I did this to punish you, she continued, her voice quiet but sharp. But you were already punishing yourself. Every time you chose power over love, control over kindness, you built the cage you're in now. I just stepped out of it. He clenched his fists. You took everything. I took back what was mine, she said, eyes steady. my dignity, my freedom, myself. For a moment, silence stretched between them. The only sound was the wind through the olive trees. He stepped closer, his tone softening. I loved you, Isabella. She gave a sad, almost pitying smile. You loved owning me. He looked away, ashamed, but pride still lingered like poison. And what now? Him. He gestured toward where Julian's car had disappeared. You think he'll love you any better? I don't know, she said simply. But at least he sees me. Her calmness enraged him more than any insult could have. He wanted her to shout, to cry, to feel something for him. But she only looked at him like a distant memory, something she'd already mourned. He took another step forward, his voice a whisper now. You can't erase me, Isabella. You know that. I don't need to, she said. You'll do that yourself. And with that, she closed the door. He stood there, frozen, the night pressing down on him like a weight. Somewhere deep inside, a realization began to form, one that frightened him. He had built his empire on fear, manipulation, and power, but none of those things could bring her back. None of them could make her look at him the way she once did. Still, Alexander Voss was not a man who surrendered easily. The next morning, he began to make calls again. Quietly, strategically. If she thought she could erase him from her world, he'd remind her who taught her the game in the first place. He began sponsoring the same charities she did, appearing at the same events, buying silent influence in the same circles. The media called it Alexander Voss's redemption tour. He let them believe it, but his eyes always found her in the crowd, her calm smile, her polite distance. It only made his resolve sharper. He started supporting her foundation anonymously at first, then publicly. Millions in donations, speeches about empowerment, public apologies on camera. People began to praise him again. And slowly, inevitably, their paths began to cross more often. One evening in London, after a conference, she found him waiting in the hallway. Still following me? She asked lightly, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. Maybe I'm just trying to do some good for once, he said. She studied him, skeptical. And is that what this is? Redemption? He smiled faintly. Maybe I just realized what I lost. She exhaled, shaking her head. You're trying to rewrite a story that's already finished. Then let me at least write a better ending. Alexander. I'm not asking for you to forgive me, he interrupted. I just need you to know I'm not the same man. She hesitated, and for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She had spent years building walls, and now here he was, still dangerous, still flawed, but no longer cruel in the same way. People don't change that easily, she said finally. Maybe not, he admitted, but they can start. Before she could answer, photographers appeared, shouting their names. She stepped back quickly, composure returning. Good night, Alexander, she said, turning away. He watched her leave, but this time he didn't follow. He didn't need to, because for the first time, Alexander wasn't chasing control. He was chasing meaning. And somewhere deep down, he knew that the story between them wasn't over. Not yet. Months passed, and the world watched as Isabella continued to rise, unshakable and radiant. Alexander followed from the shadows at first, watching her every move, learning again what it meant to be human beyond money and power. She had built an empire of influence, but it wasn't about wealth. It was about respect, justice, and empowerment. Women wrote her letters. Women told their stories. Women looked to her as a symbol of what courage and resilience could achieve. Alexander had learned that the world could strip you bare, but it could never take your dignity unless you allowed it. For the first time, he understood that wealth was not a measure of a man's worth, and control was never love. It was fear. His arrogance had been his cage, and Isabella had taught him the cost of such a life. It started subtly at first. They met at charity events, across crowded ballrooms and glittering galas. She would give a polite nod, a reserved smile, and then move on. He would watch, never intruding, letting her success shine without interference. Each time he saw her, he felt a mixture of awe and humility. He had underestimated her, and now, in the fullness of her triumph, he was learning to respect her as an equal. if not more than he'd ever done in marriage. Then came the evening that would change everything. The gala was held in Venice, in a palace overlooking the Grand Canal. Isabella had been honored for her foundation's extraordinary impact. The room glittered with crystal chandeliers, gowns swaying gracefully, champagne sparkling like captured starlight. Alexander arrived quietly, dressed impeccably, but without the imposing aura of a billionaire who commanded fear. He was there not to intimidate, but to witness. When Isabella stepped onto the stage to accept her award, the applause was thunderous. She spoke with a voice that blended strength with warmth, recounting stories of women who had overcome abuse, neglect, and oppression. She spoke of hope, resilience, and the power of reclaiming one's life. Alexander listened, and for the first time he felt true inspiration, not of wealth or domination, but of humanity. After the ceremony, she stepped into the balcony overlooking the canal, the moonlight catching the strands of her hair, making her glow with an almost ethereal beauty. Alexander approached quietly, unsure if he had the right, but compelled by the gravity of the moment. "You've done remarkable things," he said softly. She turned, her expression calm but wary. "And you? Have you learned anything yet, Alexander?" "I have," he said, meeting her gaze. "I've learned that love cannot be bought, control cannot be demanded, and cruelty is always its own punishment. I've learned that power without empathy is nothing. And I've learned that losing you was the most expensive lesson of my life, but maybe the most necessary one." Her eyes softened slightly, and for the first time, Alexander saw the flicker of the woman he had loved. Not the trophy, not the possession, but the human being who had taught him the cost of his mistakes. "You're still learning," she said, "but that's good, that's human. I don't want to just learn. I want to prove it, not to the world, not to anyone else, but to you." She studied him, silent, the wind tugging gently at her dress. There was caution in her posture, yes, but also curiosity. She had spent years building walls that no one could breach, and here was a man who had once held the key, now standing before her, humbled, transformed. "Alexander," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "you can't rewrite the past. You can't undo the years of arrogance and neglect." "I know," he admitted, "but I can be better, and I can stand beside you, not above, not behind, but with you, if you'll allow it." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked out at the moonlit canals, at the reflection of light dancing on the water. She remembered the man who had once refused to spend a dime on her, the man who had been cruel, selfish, and blind. And yet, here he was, stripped of ego, standing before her with vulnerability she hadn't expected. Finally, she turned to him, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Maybe that's a start. The next days were not easy. Alexander didn't sweep her off her feet with gifts or grand gestures. There were no declarations of love, filled with wealth and power. Instead, he worked quietly, proving that his transformation was real. He volunteered alongside her foundation, listened attentively to the women she helped, and learned the subtleties of humility and kindness. Each act, each day, was a step toward redemption, not for the world, but for the woman who had taught him how to be human again. And Isabella, for her part, allowed herself to let him into her world. Not fully, not yet, but cautiously. She had learned that real strength wasn't in vengeance or isolation, but in discerning trust and granting it wisely. Watching Alexander change before her eyes, she realized that people could evolve if they truly wanted to. The man who had once been her captor of freedom was slowly becoming her partner in life, though not in the way anyone expected. The turning point came on a quiet evening in the Italian countryside. The sky was painted with the soft pinks and purples of sunset, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers. Isabella had organized a retreat for survivors, and Alexander had accompanied her. Not to impress, not to dominate, but to serve, to support. As they walked through the gardens after the day's events, a young woman approached them, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, voice trembling. "Both of you. You've changed my life. I thought no one could ever care about people like me." Isabella smiled, her hand resting lightly on the young woman's shoulder. Alexander looked at her, watching the tenderness in her eyes, the warmth that had always existed but had been buried under years of hurt. And in that moment, he realized that this, helping others, being part of her world, is what true wealth felt like. He took her hand gently, and she allowed it without hesitation. No declarations were necessary. No grand gestures. Their fingers intertwined not as possessions, but as equals walking side by side. "See," Isabella said softly, "there is more to life than power and money." "I see it now," he whispered, eyes on her. "Because of you." Weeks turned into months, and the world continued to celebrate Isabella. But now Alexander was no longer an outsider. He was present in her world, not as a shadow, but as a man striving to be worthy. Slowly, respect grew into trust, and trust blossomed into a tentative affection, neither rushed nor forced. They had learned, painfully and beautifully, that love earned slowly and respectfully was stronger than love demanded. Then one spring morning, as the first rays of sun kissed the vineyard surrounding their villa, Alexander surprised her with something unexpected. Not a gift, not money, not grandeur, but a handwritten letter. No bank transfers, no expensive jewelry, just words that carried his heart, his regret, and his hope. "Isabella, I do not deserve your forgiveness, yet I hope one day you may grant me a chance, not to repeat the past, but to walk forward together. Not as your captor, not as your husband, not as a man of wealth, but as a human being who has learned what love truly means. If you can trust me, I will spend the rest of my life proving that I am worthy of your light." She read it quietly, a tear slipping down her cheek, not of sadness but of recognition. She had conquered fear. She had conquered cruelty. And now she was witnessing transformation, the kind that could change hearts and rewrite destinies. For the first time in years, Alexander did not measure his worth in dollars. He measured it in moments of integrity, compassion, and humility. And Isabella, standing in the morning light, realized that the man before her was no longer the one who confined her to a cage of greed and control, but someone who had been refined by his own failures, someone who could walk beside her as an equal, someone who could cherish her freedom as fiercely as she did. Their journey was far from over, and life would continue to test them in ways neither could foresee. But in that moment, standing together in the golden glow of dawn, there was no pretense, no power play, no resentment, only possibility. The possibility of love renewed, of trust rebuilt, of two lives intertwined not by wealth, status, or control, but by respect, courage, and shared humanity. And as they gazed out over the vineyard, hands intertwined, hearts steady, Isabella knew that this magnificent, difficult, and beautiful journey was a story worth living, because she had learned to reclaim her life, and he had learned to reclaim his heart. And together, they were no longer defined by the past, but by the extraordinary strength and resilience that comes when two souls, once broken, choose to rise together. The world could watch. They could talk. They could speculate. But the true victory, the victory of freedom, of love, of growth, belonged to them alone. And in the quiet that followed, with the wind brushing through the trees and the sun spilling light across the hills, Isabella and Alexander stood together, not as master and prisoner, not as owner and possession, but as equals. Two people who had faced the worst, survived it, and emerged not broken, but magnificent. Because sometimes the most enduring love is not the one that comes easily, but the one that is forged in fire, tested by pain, and ultimately tempered by understanding, forgiveness, and mutual respect. And in that shared, unspoken understanding, the future stretched before them, endless, bright, and entirely theirs.